All right, so far in our journey, we've been to Philippi, we saw the ancient ruins, we've been to Thessalonica, we were in a big city with little ruins in the middle. Now we're in Athens, and Athens is very much an active city.
Yeah, you think?
Yeah.
After the Greek and Persian War, you were left with two main powerhouse cities in Greece, which was Sparta and Athens. Athens was actually the only one who had fought the Persians alone and won a battle. That was in Marathon. Also, the Athenian navy was the largest navy, and they were instrumental in the defeat of the Persian navy at Salamis. They had a lot of prestige. Funny, Athens survived the Persians, but the Spartans eventually got them. But between the two wars, you have the golden era, the golden age of Athens. You have the big building projects like the Parthenon, which we'll see. You have the flowering of Athenian Greek philosophy, people like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. After all the Greeks down here fought their wars and were kind of tired, the Macedonians came in and took everything over. And then the result of that was his son Alexander, of course, who we know as Alexander the Great, exploded out of here, conquered the Persians, took over everything from here to India and just totally changed the world. So all over this part of the world, and Greek becomes a dominant language, which is why, again, when the gospel writers were like, what language should we write in to impact lots of people? Then they all came to the conclusion that Greek was the best idea. We're kind of halfway up the Acropolis in Athens, and I just wanted to stop quick and show you guys something. Behind me is a really, really well-preserved example of a Greek amphitheater. So that's been there for literally thousands of years. Historically, when it was first built, it would have been used for musical performances, for plays, but also for things that were a little more sinister than that. There would have been executions there, gladiatorial games, public trials, all sorts of stuff. You see that like with Paul in Ephesus, how the crowd rushes into the theater to, demand the sort of killing and expulsion of the Christians, and that all kind of goes down there. This would have been used for all sorts of public gatherings for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it's a great one because most of the ones that we still have left in this part of the world, the seats are intact, but the back wall is gone. They all had a back wall like that. And so this one has the backdrop still intact, which is really, really cool. 2,500 years later. So earlier we talked about the Battle of Marathon and how at Marathon, the Athenians by themselves fought off the Persians, and that established the prestige of Athens and eventually the wealth of Athens, and even the intellectual, all this stuff that became what Athens for really are a result of what happened at Marathon. That wasn't the end of the Persian War. The Persians didn't take a loss easy, so they lost that battle. They went back home, and they're like, 50,000 soldiers weren't enough. Let's go back with 300,000. And so they did. They raised a huge army, the biggest army the world ever seen at that time, and they invaded Greece. If you've seen the movie 300 or kind of know about the Spartans and their heroic stand at Thermopylae, that was north of here as a part of that campaign. Eventually, after 3 days, the Persians still were able to get through there. They came down here. When the Persians came here with that giant army of 300,000 people, the Persians realized they couldn't support that army without supplies. You have to feed 300,000 people every day, and that's a really hard thing to do. And so their whole navy, the Persian navy, just shadowed their army. As the army advanced on land, the navy just stayed right next to them on the coast. They would shuttle food off the ships to the people on a regular, ongoing basis. The Athenians, the rest of the Greeks, realized we don't have to beat their army. We can't beat their army. We just have to beat their navy. And if we can sink those boats, the army has to go home. And so they set a trap. And right back over here, behind me, sort of behind this island, there's a sort of you can tell that the water gets smaller as you go to the right. What the Greeks realized was they weren't actually as good as sailors as the Persians. The Greeks realized that they were better fighters. They were better brawlers. And if they could get the Phoenician or navy, which is really the Persian navy, with the Phoenicians into small space where maneuver didn't matter so much, and it just became a brawl, it got ugly, then the Greeks could win. And so the Greeks had a trap back here in a place called Salamis, and they baited the Persian navy in. They're like, you want to come here? You want to come in? And they kind of acted like they were sailing away, they were running, and there was a whole series of things that went on, espionage and tricks to suck the Persians in. But once they got in, all the Greek ships just turned on them, and there was a huge fight, and the Greeks just wiped them out. And once there's no navy and there's no food, then the army has to go. So that was sort of the end of the whole thing. But all of that drama played out right out here. You know, Piraeus, which is the port, is here. It's just Piraeus, and then go a little bit west from there. There's an idea that comes across a little bit in Paul's Mars Hill address, which is that the ancient people, the Greeks and Romans in particular, were constantly afraid of offending like a god they didn't know or one of the other gods by liking one of them too much. There was this constant tension, right? And there is this ancient story that when Athens was founded, there was a competition between Athena and Poseidon, and that the Athenians picked Athena over Poseidon to be their main god. And clearly that's the case, because you look over there in the big giant building, well, it's the Parthenon, and it was for her, and she had other statues around here too. But then they were like, well, we don't want to, piss off Poseidon too much, so let's do something for him. Yeah, that's a good idea. And so the building over here was built to honor Poseidon. They also built him a temple down at the very, very tip of Attica at a place called Sunion, as a way to be like, well, we went with her over him, but let's be sure he's not too mad at us. And so Poseidon has a couple of temples around here. This is one of them, because they were constantly concerned that there was like, well, maybe we made this one mad because we like that one, or that one mad because we like this one, or, they're constantly worried about which god they offended or made angry or something like that. And so this is an attempt to placate Poseidon, because he didn't get the number one spot. So we're standing on Mars Hill, right in the center of Athens. You can see the city all around us, the new city out there. The old Acropolis is back over, my left shoulder. And as we left the story off, Paul showed up at the city. He began to walk around down here in the Forum. And what the Bible says is, he had gone ahead of his entourage. So like Timothy, Titus, those guys had gone ahead of him. And he came here by himself. And at that point, it says he got just so disturbed by the sort of demonic pagan stuff he saw going on in the city that he just had to start preaching. So he starts preaching and teaching the Forum. But at the end of that, he's brought to Mars Hill. So right now we're standing on Mars Hill, okay? In Greece, the Areopagus. So that's where we're standing. He comes here, and he has a crowd around him. They're philosophers, they're thinkers, they're the kind of people that are agnostic or atheists, and they do so on like intellectual grounds. They want to kind of be smarter than everybody else. And I don't believe in God because there's no evidence of that. It was that kind of crowd, okay? Intelligentsia, prideful, philosophers, doubters. That's just who they were, right? So he comes up here and he begins to speak. And what I want to talk about today is the content of that address, because it's just really, truly fascinating. We have multiple addresses from Paul recorded throughout the gospel. And what you see is that when Paul speaks to groups that are Jewish, he starts with, well, you already know who God is. You already have the prophets, and you have the Torah, and so you already know a certain amount of body of information. I'm going to build on that. Here, he's talking to people who know nothing. And so he's, instead of saying, I'm going to take what you know and build on it, he has to start from zero. So it's interesting how he judges his audience and alters his presentation to fit where they are. So he actually uses their context to try to bring the gospel to them. So that's really interesting. So we just want to look at that for a minute. It says that Paul stood in the middle of the Areopagus. So that's probably somewhere right back over here. And he said, "Men of Athens, I see that you are extremely religious in every respect. For as I was passing through and observing the object of your worship, I even found an altar on which is inscribed to an unknown God." Now, the one thing I would like to throw out there is this. there's an impulse in Western culture now to take, paganism lightly. I've been in discussions with atheists before, and I kind of said I believe in God, and they say, well, which one? Zeus or Odin? Which God do you believe in? And I'm like, I believe in God, not those guys. But the idea is that those gods are farcical. We know they're just fake, and it's stupid. And there's a desire by atheist agnostic people to lump our God in the same basket, basically. So, but even for us as Christians, there's often an impulse to sort of look at that and be like, it's so stupid. There was no Aphrodite. There was no Athena. There was no, all these stories, they're kind of like kids' stories, and they don't make a whole lot of sense. And we just kind of dismiss it. Nobody ever really believed that. Nobody took it seriously. Well, the fact of the matter is, yeah, people did believe it. They did take it seriously. I mean, if you look behind me to my left at the Parthenon, and you see that gigantic structure that took vast amounts of wealth to build, and it took thousands upon thousands, if not millions of man hours to build. And what you realize is they did take it seriously. Pagans took paganism seriously. And so Paul doesn't start with, man, what y'all believe is stupid. How can you believe this? He's like, he addresses him in a way that kind of in a way affirms him. He's like, I can see that you guys are religious. You care about, spiritual things. You care about existential ideas. So let's talk about that. So he tries to find a common ground, which is really cool. And then he steps into that. And specifically, he says, hey, I saw that you had a shrine to an unknown God. Well, let me tell you about the unknown God. You don't know God, but I know who he is, and I can tell you about him. So it's just a wonderful, masterful use of, not leading with the fence, but leading with finding some common ground. It's masterful use of like looking at the culture and the context around you and saying, what can I lean into? Oh, there's something I can lean into. There's something we can talk about. And so he launches into that. He says, therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you, the God who made the world and everything in it. So he's like, listen, you've got all these gods they're kind of gods that gaps. They're explaining things, like you've got Athena, and she's wisdom, and she explains, how spider webs came to be, and Zeus explains thunder and lightning, and you kind of have your gods like this, but I want to tell you not about the sun god. I want to tell you about who made the sun. You've got a sea god, who made the sea. We're talking about a God who made it all. What they'd had back then, I think is the best way to clarify this, is they had local gods and gods of things, okay? So the Greeks had Greek gods, and the Persians had Persian gods, and the Romans had Roman gods. And they really believed that those gods were locally powerful. Even the way the Romans worked in their empire, if they came into, let's say, Egypt, and they conquered it, they invaded it. They showed up with catapults and threw rocks in the city, knocked the walls down, and maybe they damaged the temple. The Romans were like, whoa, we believe in these Egyptian gods, and we don't want to offend them because they're powerful in their own territory. So let's go back and fix that, make it nicer. So that they believed in all the gods, and they believed in local gods. And he's like, hey, I know an overarching God. Let me tell you about that. Well, that's very important. And listen to what he says about him. He said, the God who made the world and everything in it, he's the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in shrines made by hands. So he's like, first off, these temples, no good. Neither is he served by human's hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives life and breath to all things. And then a verse comes that I think, first off, is very important to me personally, but I think also he's making a point about, again, this sort of local deity concept. He says, from one man, he, meaning God, has made every nationality to live over the whole earth, and has determined their appointed times and the boundaries of where they live. So he's like, look, you think there's Greek gods and Roman gods and Egyptian gods? Like, no, there's one God who from one man made all the nations and appointed all of their times and boundaries. It's not that, the Romans didn't conquer the Greeks or the Egyptians because their gods are stronger. That's not how it works. What happened is the God of heaven and earth, the real creator God, determined that it was time for the Romans to expand because of his purposes. What were his purposes? He says that he goes on and he says he did this so they might seek God and perhaps might reach out and find them, though he's not far from each one of us. In other words, he said, well, the reason God's strategy in what nations rise and what nations fall is to grow his kingdom and spread the knowledge of him. So, when we look back on it historically, it makes perfect sense. The reason the Romans rose and expanded wasn't because Roman gods were more powerful than Greek gods or Phoenician gods or anything else. It was because God in heaven wanted there to be an empire that covered the Mediterranean, that had a solid shipping network and a solid road network where people can move around, where his word can be spread. The strategy is right there. He does this so people can hear about him. That's the strategy. And just so you'll know, I have to give a little personal note in all this. These two verses right here are literally why I'm standing in this place. A few years ago, about 5 or 6 years ago, I guess, I was sitting in my house in my computer in Beit Jala, which is a sort of part of Bethlehem, and I was listening to a Bible study online, and the presenter read those two verses. And it was during the height of the war between the Syrians, the civil war in Syria, when Syrians were just pouring out of the country, many of them coming through here and on their way to Europe. And I read this, and it just struck me, this is what's going on. God has changed the boundaries of Syria. He's moved their people so they'll hear about him. He's moved them from a place where it's hard to share the gospel into places like Greece, France, and Germany, where it's quite easy to speak. He changes the boundaries so people will hear about him. And Paul presents that. And then he goes on from there, and he says this. He says, for in him we live and move. And this translation says it exists. I think the most common translation of this is, in him we live and move and have our being. It goes on from there, and he says, even some of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. Now, what's interesting about that is, for in him we live and move and have our being, is actually lifted from Greek poetry about Zeus. Okay, so they had said that, Zeus is we live and move and have our being in him, and he's like, no, it's not true. We live, move, and have our being in God. So he moves on. So he talks about some of their sort of assumptions, and he kind of takes them out. That there's gods of separate places, that there's gods of things, that some of their philosophical ideas. He's kind, he's nice, he presents in a way that works here and works in the culture, but he still wants to land on the gospel. I think that's really important. And so this is what he says in closing. He says, therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, because if you remember at the beginning, he said, and you guys don't know. It's the God you don't know. Let me tell you about him, right? And at the end, he brings it back to that. And he says, so now you do know. He said, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God now commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has set a day when he's going to judge the world in righteousness by the man he has appointed. This is the first time he introduces Jesus. So he starts them off with, there is a God. There's a God of this universe and of the whole world. And then he says, and he sent a man, the man. He has provided proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. And he says this, and they lose it. He says, when they heard about resurrection of the dead, some began to ridicule him. So people are like, oh, this doesn't mean it's stupid. And some said, we'd like to hear about this again. And then he leaves, and a couple people convert. It's so interesting culturally. And there are two things about the gospel that are problematic to certain people in certain cultures. There are certain people that are really, really bothered by the incarnation. When you start speaking about the gospel, particularly to Jews and Muslims, they cannot wrap their heads around the incarnation. That's one of the main points of struggle for them, because they want to say God is so holy and so exalted, he can never come into human form. The Greeks had no problem with that. The Greeks were like, yeah, our gods are in human form. Have you seen the pictures? We got a statue over here. And there's even instances in the Bible where they think Paul's Apollo, like, oh, you must be Apollo, and that guy must be Zeus. And, they mistake, and of course, Paul's scandalized, by that. But they've got no problem with a God entering a human form and interacting with people. They're like, yeah, talk to us about the God-man that came down, and yeah, that's great. But then when they said, and he was killed, they're rather like, no. That's not how a God acts. Zeus or Apollo, they don't come down in human form and let themselves get crucified. That's stupid. That never happened. And resurrection? Are you kidding me? Nothing that dies comes back. In their mythology, Hades was permanent. But for those of us who believe, belief in the death and resurrection and incarnation of Jesus Christ makes all the difference. And it's really cool to me how Paul presented that here in this place in a way that just sort of made sense culturally. So Just wanted to share with you Mars Hill, a place very important to me personally. The message here changed my whole life. That's why I'm in Athens. It's because we're trying to help refugees here, because we think it's part of what God's doing. And it's also a place I think is important to anyone who shares the gospel, to think about how to change the method but not the message.
Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, click like and subscribe. It really helps us. And if you really enjoyed it, go on over to our website, thelandinthebible.com, and become a supporter. It helps us generate more content and gives you access to our full library of video and Bible study content.